Russia's nuclear doctrine is entering a critical phase of revision, driven by escalating tensions with the West. As global geopolitical dynamics shift, Moscow is reassessing its nuclear policy in response to what it sees as aggressive moves by the United States and its NATO allies. The Kremlin's decision to update its doctrine is not merely a bureaucratic exercise. It reflects deep concerns about the current global security environment, particularly regarding the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the broader implications of Western military support in regions across the world. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin's press secretary, recently emphasized that Western actions are pushing Russia to strengthen its stance on nuclear deterrence. According to Peskov, Washington and Brussels have refused to engage in meaningful dialogue with Moscow, continuously infringing upon Russia's security interests. These developments, he noted, have forced Russia to revisit its nuclear doctrine, especially in light of what he called the hot war in Ukraine. The Kremlin views the West's actions as not only prolonging this conflict, but also raising the stakes for global security. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov confirmed that amendments are underway to Russia's foundations of state policy on nuclear deterrence. These revisions, he explained, are based on lessons learned from recent conflicts, including the West's role in escalating tensions. Lavrov's comments in August further emphasized that Moscow's nuclear policy is being clarified, with Washington fully aware of the implications of such adjustments. One of the key concerns driving this shift is the perceived escalation by the United States, not only through its involvement in Ukraine, but also in other regions. Experts suggest that the US is climbing the escalation ladder, a strategic approach that could potentially lead to nuclear conflict. Russia's response, according to military experts, could involve adopting a more aggressive nuclear posture, one that signals its readiness to use nuclear weapons in the face of continued Western provocation. Sergei Karaganov, an influential scholar of international relations, has been among the voices calling for a more assertive stance in Russia's nuclear policy. In an interview with Moskovsky Komsomolets, Karaganov criticized the current doctrine as outdated, arguing that it fails to adequately respond to NATO's expansionist policies. For Karaganov, the core aim of a nuclear doctrine is deterrence through the credible threat of nuclear retaliation. Without a firm and clear stance, he warns, Russia risks emboldening its adversaries. If Moscow does not revise the wording of its doctrine and does not climb the escalation ladder, the prospects ahead are grim, Karaganov remarked. President Vladimir Putin's June remarks further underscored the urgency of these changes. According to Putin, the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons by potential adversaries is being lowered, compelling Russia to reconsider its position. He noted that Russia continues to develop its nuclear triad, the land, sea, and air-based components of its nuclear arsenal, as a guarantee of strategic balance and global stability. This development aims to preserve Russia's ability to deter aggression and maintain a balance of power in an increasingly multipolar world. The evolving global landscape, particularly the delivery of F-16 aircraft to Ukraine, has served as a critical trigger in prompting Russia to reconsider its nuclear doctrine. These fighters, classified as dual-capable platforms, are seen by Moscow as potential carriers of nuclear weapons. This perception amplifies the already tense military dynamics between Russia and NATO. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has explicitly stated that it would treat any F-16 deployment in Ukraine as a nuclear threat, heightening the stakes of military support to Kyiv. According to Oleg Krivolapov, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Military Political Studies of the Institute of the USA and Canada, Russia's current nuclear doctrine leaves room for ambiguity, especially regarding the types of missile threats that could trigger a nuclear response. As outlined in the 2020 doctrine, there is no explicit requirement to distinguish between the range or payload of missiles launched toward Russia, only that they be ballistic. However, Krivolapov suggests that an updated doctrine could remove these specifications altogether, expanding the scope of nuclear retaliation to include any missile type, whether ballistic, cruise, or hypersonic, launched from land, air, or sea. This shift reflects a broader recalibration of Russia's strategic posture, according to Andrei Klinitsyevich, head of the Center for the Study of Military and Political Conflicts. The current doctrine is primarily deterrence-based, meaning that nuclear weapons would only be used in response to an existential threat or an attack on nuclear infrastructure. However, Klinitsyevich warns that the arrival of high-precision long-range missiles like the American JASSM, which could target Russian nuclear sites, necessitates a doctrinal pivot from deterrence to intimidation. By lowering the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons, Russia could signal to its adversaries that any attempt to strike its territory with advanced missiles would provoke a nuclear response, thus eliminating any doubts about Moscow's readiness to escalate if needed. Klinitsyevich foresees that the revised doctrine will not only clarify when Russia might deploy tactical versus strategic nuclear weapons, but also address broader questions about the number of delivery systems and methods of deployment. Could Russia, for instance, conduct nuclear tests in the Arctic or space to demonstrate its capabilities and resolve? These are some of the pivotal issues likely to be included in the revamped Foundations of State Policy on Nuclear Deterrence. On the other hand, nuclear expert Alexei Anpilogov anticipates a more conservative revision. Despite the shifting rhetoric, he argues that Russia is unlikely to incorporate provisions for a preemptive nuclear strike, in contrast to the US, whose doctrine contains ambiguous language that allows for first strike scenarios under certain conditions. And Pilogov believes Russia will remain committed to a retaliatory posture, while still tightening its doctrinal language to remove any uncertainty about its readiness to defend itself in the face of escalating threats. The idea of climbing the escalation ladder has become a central focus in the discussions surrounding the evolving dynamics between Russia and the US, particularly in light of their respective nuclear postures. This concept, originally developed by nuclear strategist Herman Kahn in 1965, describes the progression of conflict through 44 theoretical steps, with each stage representing an increasingly intense level of military confrontation. Today, experts suggest that both nations are navigating this ladder, hovering around the 13th step, where the threat of limited tactical nuclear strikes looms large. According to Andrei Klinitsyevich, head of the Center for the Study of Military and Political Conflicts, we are now at a crucial juncture where the threat of tactical nuclear weapons being used on a limited scale has become real. Yet, despite the heightened risk, Klinitsyevich does not foresee an imminent full-scale war with NATO. What complicates the situation is NATO's own strategic thinking, which, as famously articulated by Henry Kissinger, does not exclude the possibility of a limited nuclear conflict, particularly in Europe. The devastation that such a war would bring to European territory could, in the cynical view of some experts, benefit powers like the US and the UK, as they might exploit the chaos for economic and political gains. One of the key issues driving this nuclear recalibration is the rise of intermediate-range and shorter-range missile threats, particularly after the demise of the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty following the U.S. withdrawal. The deployment of American intermediate-range systems, including SM-6 missiles and Tomahawk cruise missiles, which have the potential to carry nuclear warheads, presents a direct threat to Russia. Klinitsievich warns that the risk of a preemptive strike where Russia might miss an incoming attack is becoming too great to ignore. To counter this, Russia is revisiting its mothballed missile projects, including containerized installations for Caliber cruise missiles and ground-based platforms for the Zircon hypersonic missile system. Oleg Krivolapov, a senior research fellow at the Center for Military Political Studies of the Institute of the USA and Canada, echoes these concerns, particularly with NATO's recent decision to deploy INF systems in Europe by 2026. Although the US insists these systems are non-nuclear, Krivolapov points out that Russia is likely to assume a worst-case scenario, as Tomahawk missiles were nuclear capable until 2011. A temporary deployment could easily turn permanent, especially if relations between Russia and NATO deteriorate further. The dissolution of the INF Treaty in 2019 has led some Russian experts to suggest that if American missiles are stationed in Europe, Moscow may need to contemplate a transition from its current retaliatory strike doctrine to a preemptive strike doctrine. While such a shift is not guaranteed, a revision of Russia's nuclear doctrine could include broader criteria for when a nuclear response might be warranted. Krivolapov suggests that the elimination of specific language regarding ballistic missiles could be replaced with more flexible wording that covers cruise and hypersonic missiles, precisely the types NATO is planning to deploy in Europe. Beyond missile threats, the disparity in missile defense capabilities remains a pressing concern for Moscow. The US has advanced its Aegis Ashore missile defense systems, positioning them closer to Russian borders. With these interceptors capable of engaging targets up to 2,500 kilometers away, Russia's strategic options have been limited. Klinitsievich speculates that, in response, Russia may look to deploy its own missile systems in Latin America, potentially reviving a modern version of Operation Anadyr, the covert Soviet deployment of nuclear missiles to Cuba during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Nuclear expert Alexei Anpilogov agrees that the current escalation could lead to a scenario reminiscent of Operation Anadyr. However, he questions whether Moscow would opt for such a direct confrontation, pondering who might play the role of Cuba today. In the early 1960s, the US forced the USSR's hand when its strategic forces were still in their infancy, but today, Russia's nuclear deterrence capabilities are far more robust. Anpilogov believes that while a more covert operation may be plausible, a revision of the nuclear doctrine might not explicitly reflect such moves. Instead, the focus could remain on demonstrating US vulnerabilities, particularly at the pre-nuclear level. Krivolapov concludes that despite the increasing tensions, there remains room for maneuver between Russia and the US short of nuclear conflict. Both sides, he suggests, are keenly aware of the risks, and even as they ascend Khan's escalation ladder, there is still hope that diplomatic efforts and strategic recalibration can avert a catastrophic clash. In this fraught geopolitical climate, Russia's potential revisions to its nuclear doctrine are more than just a reaction to immediate threats. They represent a long-term strategy to navigate the complex, multipolar world of the 21st century. Whether through adjustments in missile deployment, shifts in doctrine, or new deterrence measures, Russia is signaling to the world that it remains a formidable nuclear power, ready to defend its interests in an increasingly unstable international system.